no further ado, give him a big round of applause.
My turn? Well, we'll see if this works. I have about 200 slides, and we're going to have to move through them quick, and the sun is taking its time going down. If the slides don't work, I guess since one picture is 1,000 words, I'm going to have to speak 200,000 words. So Brian, if you could keep track and let me know when I hit 200,000, I'll stop. I think what I'll do is pick up on some of the themes that I heard Daniel talking about, some of the things I really resonated with, particularly when he was talking about the cycles and the apocalypse and so forth that he's been looking into, because that's been one of the things that I've been studying for many years. And it actually goes back to my childhood growing up in Minnesota. I think just as Daniel's journey started with him when he was a youngster, I think in fact with everybody, your journey really starts when you're a young person and those first impressions you get. And I was privileged enough to be living a very rural existence in Minnesota in land that had been created by the Great Ice Age. And so from a very early age, I got very interested in what were these features and the phenomena in the landscape around me that were so incredible and wonderful that I, literally used to sometimes go into a trance as a child, trying to contemplate why there was this gigantic erratic boulder, for example, in our backyard that had no business being there. But I spent many an enjoyable hour on top of that boulder with my stick in hand fighting off dragons and dinosaurs and stuff. And as I got a little older, I got into the thing that a lot of us got into back in the late 60s and early 70s. And I began to have a series of experiences. Primarily, I moved from the country to the city and lived in the city of Minneapolis for a couple of years. And I always missed my country roots. So I started the summer of 69 and 70, I just started going out and spending time living in the woods, hitchhiked from the East Coast to the West Coast, and spent lots of time in canyons and forests and doing various substances and so forth. But there was a couple of experiences that I had, one in particular that really set my course. I was doing, something that's related to cacti, and there was a river in Minnesota called the Minnesota River. And the Minnesota River was one of these great post-glacial ice age streams that had been swollen to many thousands of times its present volume. And there was a rock concert at an airport. It was called Flying Cloud Airport, and they had this airport that was up on these bluffs, and the bands would play, and then they'd take a break, and I was, I think, pretty intensively in an altered state, and I decided to take a break, and I walked over, and I sat down on the bluff, and while I was sitting there, I had this experience of being removed from the present and taken out of time, and seeing the landscape at various phases of its evolution. That's the only way I can describe it. And as I sat on this bluff, I looked down below me, and I'm going to show you some slides of these kinds of things so you're going to see it for yourself. As I looked down in this great valley below me, I saw the Minnesota River, a little ribbon, flowing on the bottom of this great channel. And I was sitting on these bluffs that were maybe 400, 500 feet high. And a mile or mile and a half on the other side, there was a matching set of bluffs. And my experience, my realization is that I was having, without knowing the term, I was having a direct perception of the scale invariance phenomena in nature, which is that there are patterns that are reflected consistently regardless of the scale that you perceive them on. And we can talk from the micro scale to the human scale to the macro scale and everything in between. That's a major insight that geologists have become aware of, and that's why if you look in a geology textbook and they have photographs of geological formations, you'll always see either a person standing there, or you'll see a hat, or you'll see a rock hammer, because absent that, you have no concept of scale. What are we looking at? Is this something that's, something that you would, 3 feet wide, or is it 300 feet wide? you can't tell without the scale. Well, that's because a lot of features in geology are scale invariant. A lot of things in nature are scale invariant. When we study sacred geometry, that's one of the foundation concepts of the whole system, is the idea of scale invariance, that by studying the ratios and proportions that we see on the human scale, we can actually get access to the larger proportions that govern the much larger scale universe, or the much smaller proportions that govern things on the atomic or the molecular level. I'll give an example. I'm going to show you here shortly about this concept of the great year, because when we talk about the issue of 2012, I mean, I resonate with everything that Daniel had to say about that, and I'm kind of with him. I don't necessarily think it's going to be catastrophic. I do think, however, though, that it's a critical thing for us to become aware of, because that is actually, if anybody has studied astrology, you're aware that in astrology you have to have a fiducial point. That is an anchor point, something from which measuring can begin. If you look at any measuring tape, it's got a 0 on it. If you look at any system of measure, you have to have, if you look at a Cartesian coordinate system, it's got a 0 point on it. You've got to have some kind of reference in order to understand what you're looking at. 2012, as I'm going to show you with my slides here, is actually a way of hooking into this whole grand cycle of the great year. And a great year, I believe, is probably the single most important understanding that we can have at this particular time, because it's the great year that governs the unfolding of the great cycles and the great earth changes. The rises and falls of civilization are influenced and affected by the cycle of the great year. And there's a wonderful book called Hamlet's Mill that came out in 1969, a pivotal year, and that book deals with the idea that archaic cultures were intimately familiar with the great year cycle. Now, what is the great year cycle? What it is, it has to do with Earth's third motion, and everybody knows that our day-to-day activities are literally governed by the Earth turning on its axis. Hence, we're sitting here waiting for the sun to go down a few more minutes. It's not the sun going down, is it? It's the planet that we're sitting on here is turning like this. So as we're turning like this at about, probably at this latitude, maybe 700 to 800 miles per hour relative to a fixed point, we're spinning, the sun is going down, and we govern our lives by the diurnal or daily rotation of the Earth on its axis. Likewise, on a larger sense, our lives are governed by the annual revolution of the Earth about the sun. Our whole agricultural cycle is dependent upon that. All of the ancient cultures were totally intimately in tune with that cycle, much more so than our modern culture, because we have essentially become segregated from these intimate cycles of nature that our ancestors were so familiar with. But they literally built whole cities laid out that allowed them to map the motions of the heavens with a degree of accuracy and intimacy that hasn't been equaled probably until about the mid-20th century of our own times. And why would they do this? Why would they go to such extensive lengths, given the technologies that they had at that time, to try to create temples, to try to create urban areas that could actually be reflections of the motions of the heavens? There are many examples of celestial patterns being mapped to Earth. We could look at I've shown in my slides, probably won't get to it tonight, how the Gothic cathedrals dedicated to the Notre Dame in France form an effigy of the constellation of Virgo. We could look at the temples in Cambodia, the Angkor Wat and Angkor Thom complex, showing that it is a map of the constellation of Draco. We could find numerous examples of this. There are many of the Indian mounds that were built in North America were actually laid out on a cosmic grid pattern, so that it allowed the peoples here that were here before the Europeans arrived to track solar and lunar and planetary, and in some cases stellar motion with a great deal of accuracy, way beyond what they would need for a simple agricultural calendar. And so early on, Daniel mentioned the Hopi concept of the 4 world ages, which is a reflection of universal